mostly because of the posturing around who has funded the movement against the Adani mine, this environmental challenge, and the adequacy of the environmental approvals granted at the federal level. The development is probably less important than people let on. The Adani mine has been under development for quite some time, and they had announced, in fact, a cutback on their development prior to the development with respect to this environmental approval. So while Abbott is calling this sabotage and others at the state level are quite concerned by the approval process, for the Adani project itself, it may be potentially less important. The bigger issue is how do we manage approvals generally for mining projects? And at least from my perspective, they are overly lengthy. And I think even 6 months ago or so, a report by the Minerals Council of Australia made comment that if we could slash our approval time by 1 year, it would have a very, very significant impact on national GDP, somewhere in the order of, I think, close to 1%. So, that's a very big consequence that we are allowing to be undermined, I think, by a delay in approvals, not necessarily with respect to the quality of approvals, but the process of time is really the big problem. And I think that's what Tony Abbott was concerned by.
And just anecdotally, are you seeing this impact entrance into the resources arena or an exit by existing players?
Well, yeah, really the industry itself is driven more by the economic fundamentals than they are by the governmental process for approvals. We've seen recently the sale by Sumitomo and Vale of their Isaac Plains mine for $1. This mine was purchased by Sumitomo 3 or 4 years ago for $400 million, and they're exiting for essentially nothing, as is Vale. Now, that has nothing really to do with environmental approvals. The international community looking at projects in Australia might be a little more wary of developments in Australia. In fact, in the past, there's a group called the Fraser Institute that looks at mining jurisdictions around the world and their legislation, and had rated Australian jurisdictions like New South Wales and Queensland very low, in fact, under places like Namibia, Botswana, and other parts of Africa. So there's a sentiment, I think, globally that we have a challenging regulatory environment. But frankly, I think the issue that we're facing in Australia today is economics. It's not legislation and regulatory approvals. The economics are dire, and the major mining houses are looking to divest.
Well, you're also seeing at least one bright spot for growth, and that's in energy storage.
If you look at the mining sector in Australia, at least in Queensland and New South Wales, it's heavily driven by coal. And the reason for that is coal is a very reliable and often quite cheap baseload power solution for energy production. Now, we've seen a tremendous tumbling in prices for solar PVs on rooftops, and I think we now have something like 500,000 homes in Queensland that have solar PV on their roofs. And the result of that is that we are shifting power production dramatically. Now, the big shift that will occur beyond solar PVs on roofs is making industrial scale solar available. And the challenge with industrial scale solar is that you can't necessarily turn that into baseload power because it's only on when the sun is out. The result is that major investors are looking at how to create grid scale battery solutions. And some of these are more common. We've seen, for example, the pumping up of water to a higher reservoir and then allowing that water down in the middle of the evening or night to produce power at different times of the day. So you can convert solar into baseload power in certain circumstances. We now are beginning to see this really being played out in a broader way. Interestingly, I chaired a conference last month on power and energy in Queensland, and the conversation was around how solar PV and solar projects generally might make the system, the grid itself, more reliable by placing solar PV grid scale production at the periphery of the electric grid. Because if you have a baseload plant, you have to wheel that power, transmit that power out maybe 100 kilometers, sometimes a lot further. And there's electrical losses. So if we can start putting in place renewable power on the edges of the grid and then combine that with small-scale battery storage, we will transform the outlook for power generation in Australia.
Well, on that point, the Clean Energy Council has put forth some objectives to foster growth in this sector. What are some of these regulatory goals?
Yeah, look, the goals are pretty consistent, which are how can we rapidly adopt renewable power generation through Australia, and can we motivate or incentivize investors into these projects. It was quite surprising to me, a project in New South Wales that was funded by a international power developer, in which they were able to obtain something close to $100 million in grant funding, and then another $50 million in subordinated loans to be able to get up a project. This was again a solar baseload power project in New South Wales. And that seemed quite interesting to me, that the government was willing to provide such dramatic funding for what I would think is an economic project on its own. So we will be seeing, I suspect, at the federal level and at the state level, more and more investment into base power renewable projects.
And are there any developments in the U.S. in this space that you'd like to see replicated here in Australia?
We have the Gigafactory that's being developed by Tesla, which, if I understand right, is potentially going to bring battery power down to $100 a kilowatt hour, about 1/4 the price it currently is today. Now, these developments in the United States are driven first and foremost by regulatory settings that are encouraging solar PV and battery and electric power vehicles to become more user friendly. So that involves both installing fast chargers for the grid to allow cars to have greater mobility, and also allowing those cars to have a broader range. A lot of the vehicles that we've seen so far are around 2 to 250 kilometers in distance, and that is what I hear tell range anxiety as the concern. So when you look to Australia, well, the regulatory challenges that we need to be looking at include where and how will we be installing electric fast chargers? Is it going to be mandated so that there's an acceleration in projects? I would think that might be one of the more interesting developments that we can be looking at in Australia.